In the winter of 1862, along the muddy banks of the Mississippi River, in a cotton plantation that stretched as far as the eye could see, a colonel of distinguished lineage entered into an agreement so unspeakable that it would become the whispered shame of 3 generations. What began as a desperate bargain to secure an heir would unravel into madness, murder, and the complete dissolution of one of the most prominent families in the antebellum South. You are watching Shadows of the South, where we exhume the most disturbing and forgotten stories of the slave-holding South, the tales that reveal the true moral cost of a system built on human bondage. Colonel Thaddeus Beaumont Ashford was 43 years old in the spring of 1862, the master of Ashford Hall, a cotton empire of nearly 2,000 acres worked by 260 enslaved souls. He was a West Point graduate, a veteran of the Mexican War, a Presbyterian elder, and by all accounts of the local gentry, a gentleman of impeccable breeding and moderate temperament. His wife, Eleanor Catherine Ashford, née Pemberton, was 31 years old, the daughter of a Charleston shipping magnate, educated at a finishing school in Virginia, fluent in French, accomplished at the pianoforte, and by the cruel standards of that time and place barren. They had been married for 11 years, and in that decade of silk gowns and Sunday services, of harvest balls and mint juleps on wide verandas, Eleanor had failed to produce the one thing that mattered most in the aristocratic South, a legitimate male heir to carry forward the Ashford name. The plantation itself was a monument to accumulated wealth and inherited privilege. The main house rose 3 stories above the delta soil, with Corinthian columns that caught the morning light, wide galleries that ran the length of each floor, and imported Italian marble in the entrance hall. Behind the great house stretched the quarters, rows of weathered cabins where the enslaved lived in conditions that ranged from merely harsh to unspeakable. The cotton fields extended in all directions, a white sea at harvest time, worked by hands that would never hold the profits they created. The Ashfords were Presbyterians of the strict observance, believers in predestination and the divine ordering of society, adherents to the doctrine that slavery was ordained by Scripture and sanctified by God Himself. On Sundays, Colonel Ashford would read from Ephesians to the assembled slaves in the yard, "Servants, be obedient to them that are your masters according to the flesh, with fear and trembling." He believed every word. By 1862, the war had come to Mississippi, though Ashford Hall remained largely untouched by the chaos that was consuming the Confederacy. The colonel had purchased his way out of active service, contributing generously to the cause while remaining on his land to oversee the production of cotton that would, theoretically, finance the Southern Rebellion. But the war was not his primary concern that year. His obsession was lineage legacy and the growing certainty that his wife would never give him children. Eleanor had endured 7 miscarriages in 11 years, each one leaving her more fragile, more withdrawn, more convinced that she had failed in her singular duty as a wife. The colonel consulted physicians in Natchez, in Memphis, in New Orleans. They prescribed rest, changes in diet, various tonics and tinctures, and when those failed, they prescribed nothing at all, for medical science had reached the limits of its understanding. The physicians did not tell the colonel what they suspected, that the problem might well lie with him, not with his wife. Such truths were unspeakable in a culture that measured manhood by dominion and fertility. It was Eleanor herself who first spoke the unspeakable. On Christmas Eve of 1861, in the library of Ashford Hall, after the enslaved had finished singing carols in the yard, and the house had fallen silent, she told her husband that she had a proposal. She had been reading, she said, about the patriarchs of the Old Testament, about Abraham and Sarah, about the handmaidens who bore children in their mistress's stead. She spoke carefully, her voice barely above a whisper, her hands folded in her lap like a penitent in church. What if, she suggested, what if they were to follow that biblical precedent? What if they were to select certain men from among the slaves, men of good health and pleasing appearance, and what if she were to conceive by one of them, and the child would be raised as the colonel's legitimate heir? The colonel did not interrupt her. He sat very still in his leather chair, a glass of bourbon untouched on the table beside him, and when she finished speaking, he said nothing for a long time. When he finally spoke, he asked her only this, "And you would be willing, truly willing?" She nodded, her eyes dry, her face composed. "For the family," she said, "for the name." Pause for a moment and reflect. In a society where enslaved people were legal property, where their bodies could be bought and sold, and used in any manner the master saw fit, even the most intimate human act could become a transaction of power. What Eleanor proposed was not love, not even desire. It was a commercial arrangement conducted with human flesh, a breeding program no different in its essence from the selection of horses or cattle, except that the stakes were a white family's honor and a dynasty's continuation. The colonel agreed. Over the course of January 1862, he and Eleanor established the terms of what they called, in their private conversations, the arrangement. They would select 6 men from among the enslaved population, men between the ages of 20 and 35, men who were strong and healthy, and by the aesthetic standards of the white gaze, physically attractive. These men would be brought to the main house on designated nights, and Eleanor would receive them in a room that had been prepared for this purpose, a small bedroom on the 2nd floor, at the far end of the east wing, far from the colonel's own chambers. The colonel would not be present during these encounters, but he would know when they occurred. Each man would be brought to Eleanor 3 times, on 3 separate nights, and then the next man would take his place. The entire cycle would take approximately 2 months. If Eleanor conceived, the colonel would claim the child as his own, and no one outside the main house would ever know the truth. If she did not conceive, they would repeat the process. The selected men would be told nothing except that they had been summoned to the big house and must obey. They would receive no explanation, no choice, no voice in the matter whatsoever. They were, after all, property. The 6 men chosen were as follows: Samuel, aged 32, a field hand and blacksmith, with broad shoulders and a reputation for steady work, the father of 3 children by his wife Dinah. Moses, aged 28, a house servant who could read and write, taught in secret by a previous overseer's daughter, a man of quiet dignity, who moved through the world with careful precision. Jacob, aged 25, a driver who supervised other slaves in the fields, strong and commanding, feared by some, respected by others. Isaac, aged 29, a carpenter and cooper, who built the plantation's barrels and furniture, known for the elegance of his hands and the quality of his craft. Daniel, aged 27, a stable hand who worked with the colonel's horses, a man who understood animals better than he understood people, gentle in his movements, and soft-spoken in his rare words. And Elijah, aged 23, the youngest of the 6, a field hand with a beautiful singing voice, who led the work songs in the cotton fields, whose mother had been sold away when he was 12, and whose eyes carried a sorrow that never quite lifted. In early February, the overseer, a hard man named Clayton Burke, summoned Samuel to the main house just after sunset. Samuel was not told why. He walked from the quarters to the big house in the winter cold, his heart beating fast, because a summons after dark could mean anything: punishment, sale, or death. But when he entered through the back door, he was met not by Burke but by Hattie, the head house servant, an elderly woman who had served the Ashford family for 40 years. Hattie's face revealed nothing. She led Samuel upstairs, down a long hallway, lit by oil lamps, to a door at the end of the corridor. She opened the door, gestured for him to enter, and closed it behind him without a word. Inside, Eleanor Ashford sat in a chair beside a narrow bed, dressed in a white nightgown, her hair loose around her shoulders. She did not look at him directly. She spoke in a voice that was steady but hollow, as though she were reciting instructions she had memorized. "You will do as I tell you," she said. "You will speak only if I ask you a question. When we are finished, you will leave and you will tell no one what occurred here. Do you understand?" Samuel, standing just inside the door, his hat in his hands, nodded. He understood nothing except that he had no choice. What happened in that room over the course of February and March 1862 cannot be described as consensual, for consent requires the possibility of refusal, and these men had no such possibility. They were enslaved. Their bodies were not their own. What Eleanor sought was a biological function, the mechanical transfer of seed into womb, and yet the men she summoned were not machines. They were human beings with thoughts and fears, and an understanding of the grotesque violation being enacted upon them. Samuel returned to the quarters after that first night, and could not look his wife in the eye. Moses, who came next, spent his 3 nights in stony silence, performing what was required, and then leaving without a word, but those who knew him said he seemed to age a decade in the span of those weeks. Jacob, the driver, approached the arrangement with a kind of grim pragmatism, as though this were simply one more cruelty in a life already defined by cruelty. Isaac, the carpenter, wept quietly on his second night, and Eleanor, unnerved by his tears, told him to stop, that he was making it harder for both of them. Daniel, the stable hand, moved through the encounters, as though in a trance, his mind somewhere else entirely, perhaps with the horses he tended, perhaps in some memory of freedom he had never actually known. And Elijah, the youngest, sang softly under his breath as he walked to the main house each night, old spirituals, about crossing over Jordan, about climbing Jacob's ladder, about a home beyond this world of sorrow. By late March, Eleanor believed she might be pregnant. She missed her monthly courses, and she felt a queasiness in the mornings that the physicians had told her was a hopeful sign. The colonel was informed, and he responded with a restrained satisfaction, a nod of the head, and a brief clasping of her hand. The arrangement was suspended. The 6 men returned to their regular duties, and the household resumed its outward appearance of normalcy. But of course, nothing was normal. The enslaved community knew something had happened, even if they did not know the details. There were whispers in the quarters, speculations, rumors that swirled and grew, and took on lives of their own. Some said the mistress had taken lovers, some said the colonel had gone mad, some said the whole family was cursed by God for their sins. Hattie, the only servant who knew the full truth, kept her silence, but her silence was its own kind of testimony. If you are finding these stories as haunting as they are necessary, I encourage you to subscribe to Shadows of the South. We continue to uncover the forgotten atrocities and moral reckonings that the American South has long tried to bury. These are not just tales of the past, they are reflections of the systems of power and dehumanization that shaped a nation. Stay with us as we walk through these shadows together. Eleanor miscarried again in early May. The pregnancy had lasted only 8 weeks, a small flutter of hope extinguished in a night of pain and blood. The colonel received the news in his study, alone, and for the first time in his adult life, he broke down. He wept not for his wife, not for the lost child, but for himself, for his name, for the dynasty that was slipping through his fingers like sand. Eleanor lay in bed for 2 weeks after the miscarriage, pale and silent, attended by Hattie and the other house servants, and when she finally rose, she was not the same woman. Something in her had fractured. Her eyes were vacant, her movements mechanical. She spoke rarely and ate little. The colonel, desperate and spiraling into his own form of madness, proposed that they resume the arrangement. Eleanor agreed without hesitation, without emotion, as though she had become a machine designed for a single purpose. In June, the cycle began again. The same 6 men, summoned once more to the room at the end of the east wing, where Eleanor awaited them with the same hollow instructions and the same joyless determination. But this time, the plantation itself seemed to revolt against what was happening. The cotton crop began to fail, the bolls rotting on the stem in a wet summer of unseasonable rain. 2 of the field hands died of fever, and the quarters buzzed with talk of a curse, of divine retribution, of sin being visited upon the land. The overseer, Clayton Burke, grew increasingly uneasy, sensing the unrest but unable to identify its source. He increased the frequency of punishments, believing that discipline would restore order, but the lash only deepened the simmering rage. Pause again and consider, in a system that reduces human beings to instruments of labor and reproduction, every act of degradation reverberates outward, poisoning not just the enslaved, but the enslavers themselves. The colonel and his wife believed they were exercising their rightful dominion, following a biblical precedent, but what they were actually doing was enacting a horror so profound that it destabilized the entire social order they claimed to uphold. Power, when taken to its logical extreme, becomes a form of madness. It was Samuel's wife, Dinah, who first spoke openly of what was happening. In late June, during a Sunday gathering in the quarters, after the required religious service led by the colonel, Dinah stood in the center of the yard and addressed the assembled enslaved community. Her voice shook with fury and grief. She said that her husband had been taken to the big house, that he had returned changed, that she knew what had been done to him and to the others. She named the 6 men, she named the mistress, she called it rape, and in doing so she named a truth that the white world would never acknowledge. The enslaved listeners stood in stunned silence, because to speak such things aloud was to risk death, and yet Dinah could not remain silent. Her husband tried to quiet her, his hands on her shoulders, his voice pleading, but she shrugged him off. "They treat us like animals," she said, "and then they wonder why we don't smile." Word of Dinah's outburst reached the colonel within hours. He summoned the overseer and ordered Dinah whipped 30 lashes, a punishment severe enough to silence her and terrify the others. But before Burke could carry out the order, something extraordinary happened. The 6 men, Samuel, Moses, Jacob, Isaac, Daniel, and Elijah, walked together to the main house and stood in a line before the front door. They said nothing, they made no threats, they simply stood there, in broad daylight, in a posture of collective refusal. It was an act of staggering courage and desperation, for they knew it could result in their deaths. The colonel emerged onto the front gallery, his face red with rage, and ordered them to disperse. They did not move. He called for the overseer, for the dogs, for the rifles, and still they did not move. The standoff lasted only 10 minutes, but in that time, something shifted. The colonel saw in their faces not defiance but utter depletion, an emptiness born of violation, and perhaps for the first time in his life, he recognized them as men. He rescinded the order for Dinah's punishment. He told the 6 to return to their quarters, and then he went inside and locked himself in his study. Eleanor, watching from an upstairs window, understood that the arrangement could not continue. She also understood that it was too late. The damage had been done. The covenant between master and slave, already a fiction sustained only by violence, had been irreparably broken at Ashford Hall. Over the following weeks, the plantation began to collapse from within. Enslaved workers moved slowly, deliberately, performing their tasks with just enough effort to avoid punishment but no more. Tools went missing, fires broke out in the barn and the smokehouse, small fires that were quickly extinguished but whose origins were never determined. The colonel's authority, once absolute, now felt tenuous. He stopped reading scripture to the slaves on Sundays. He stopped appearing on the front gallery. He began drinking heavily, bourbon before noon, whiskey through the evening, until he passed out in his chair. In August, a letter arrived from Charleston. Eleanor's father had died, and her mother was ill. Eleanor left Ashford Hall to attend to her family, and she did not return for 3 months. In her absence, the colonel's behavior grew increasingly erratic. He wandered the plantation at night, calling out to no one, speaking to shadows. The house servants reported that he would stand for hours in the room where the arrangement had taken place, staring at the empty bed, muttering prayers or curses, they could not tell which. He began to suspect conspiracies everywhere. He accused the overseer of theft, the house servants of poisoning his food, the field hands of plotting insurrection. He purchased additional firearms and kept them loaded in every room of the main house. He slept poorly and ate less. By October, he looked 20 years older, his face gaunt, his eyes sunken and wild. The scandal, meanwhile, had begun to spread beyond the plantation. Rumors reached the neighboring estates, traveled along the river, arrived in the churches and parlors of Natchez and Vicksburg. The details were garbled and exaggerated, but the core of the story was there. Colonel Ashford had allowed his wife to lie with slaves in an attempt to produce an heir. The response from the white community was swift and brutal. The Ashfords were quietly excluded from social gatherings. Invitations were withdrawn. Business associates found reasons to sever their connections. The Presbyterian Church, after an inquiry by the elders, asked the colonel to step down from his position. The Southern aristocracy, so deeply invested in the mythology of white purity and racial hierarchy, could not tolerate the violation that Ashford represented. He had not merely broken a taboo, he had exposed the fundamental hypocrisy of a system that claimed moral superiority, while routinely raping enslaved women and fathering mixed-race children, who were then sold away or kept in bondage. What the colonel had done was different, only in its inversion. A white woman, a white man's wife, had been touched by black hands. This the white South could not forgive. In December 1862, Eleanor returned to Ashford Hall. She found her husband a broken man, the plantation in disarray, the house staff reduced by desertions, and the fields half-harvested. She found him in his study, on the evening of December 17th, sitting at his desk with a pistol in his hand. She did not try to stop him. She simply closed the door and walked away. The gunshot was heard throughout the house, a single sharp crack that echoed across the cold December night. The colonel was found by Hattie the next morning, slumped over his desk, a bullet through his right temple, a letter beside him addressed to no one. The letter, which was later burned by Eleanor, allegedly contained a confession of sorts, an acknowledgement that he had destroyed his family, his name, and his soul in pursuit of an heir that God had refused to grant him. Consider for a moment the layers of tragedy in this. A man raised to believe in his divine right to own other human beings, taught that his bloodline and his name were the measure of his worth, confronted finally with the emptiness of those beliefs. The colonel's suicide was not an act of remorse, not really. It was the final assertion of a man who could not bear to live in a world where his power had proven meaningless. He took his own life because he could not accept that he had failed, not as a slaveholder, but as a man. Eleanor Ashford did not attend her husband's funeral. She remained in the main house for 6 weeks after his death, settling his debts, selling off portions of the land, and making arrangements for the future. In February 1863, she gathered the 6 men, Samuel, Moses, Jacob, Isaac, Daniel, and Elijah, and met with them in the library. What she said to them was never recorded, but according to later accounts passed down through the enslaved community, she offered them something extraordinary. She told them she would not stop them from leaving. She could not free them, not legally, not without inviting ruin upon herself, but she would look the other way. She would tell the overseer they had run off, and she would not pursue them. It was not freedom, not exactly, but it was a door left unlocked. Samuel chose to stay, at least for a time, because his wife and children were there, and he could not leave them. Moses left that very night, heading north toward Union lines, and he was never heard from again. Jacob also stayed, becoming a field foreman after the war, and eventually purchasing a small plot of land. Isaac left in the spring, and made his way to Memphis, where he worked as a carpenter and lived into old age. Daniel remained with the horses until the plantation was sold, and then he drifted west, his fate unknown. Elijah, the youngest, left in March, and was reportedly killed by Confederate pickets before he reached the Tennessee border. His body was never recovered. Eleanor sold Ashford Hall in the summer of 1863 to a speculator from New Orleans. She moved to Mobile, Alabama, where she lived under an assumed name for the rest of her life, working as a seamstress and music tutor. She never remarried. She never spoke publicly about what had happened at Ashford Hall. She died in 1891, at the age of 60, and was buried in an unmarked grave in a churchyard that has since been paved over and forgotten. She left no children, no heirs, no legacy, except the dark story that clung to her name like a ghost. The plantation itself changed hands several times over the following decades. The main house burned down in 1878 in a fire of suspicious origin. The land was subdivided and sold to smaller farmers. The quarters were torn down or left to rot. By the turn of the 20th century, there was almost nothing left of Ashford Hall, except a few crumbling foundation stones and the stories that the descendants of the enslaved kept alive. Those stories, passed down through generations, preserved the names of the 6 men, their suffering, and their quiet acts of resistance. The stories also preserve the names of the children born in the quarters during and after 1862, children whose paternity was uncertain, whose features sometimes suggested a mixing of bloodlines, and who carried the weight of that uncertainty all their lives. In the official records of Warren County, Mississippi, Colonel Thaddeus Beaumont Ashford is noted simply as having died by his own hand in December 1862, a casualty, the records suggest, of the stresses of wartime. There is no mention of the arrangement, no mention of the 6 men, no mention of the moral catastrophe that consumed his household. The white South, as it so often did, closed ranks and erased the story, preferring silence to the unbearable truth. But the story did not die. It lived on in the memories of the enslaved and their descendants, a testament to the depravity of a system that treated human beings as livestock, that turned intimacy into commerce, that destroyed everyone it touched, enslaved and enslaver alike. Pause one final time and reflect on this. The American institution of slavery was not merely an economic system or a political arrangement. It was a totalizing horror that corrupted every aspect of human life it entered. It made monsters of men who believed themselves civilized. It made victims of women who believed themselves virtuous. It reduced human reproduction to a matter of profit and power, and it left scars that have never fully healed, wounds that we are still, more than a century and a half later, struggling to understand and address. The story of Ashford Hall is not unique. It is one story among thousands, tens of thousands, all of them variations on the same theme of dehumanization and destruction. The difference is only that this story, by some accident of memory and transmission, survived. The 6 men who were used in Eleanor Ashford's desperate scheme were not the architects of the tragedy. They were its victims, as surely as any person sold on an auction block or worked to death in a cotton field. They had no power, no choice, no voice in what was done to them, and yet they retained their humanity, their dignity, their capacity for resistance, even if that resistance took the form of simply standing together in front of a door and refusing to move. That moment of collective courage did not free them, did not end their bondage, did not prevent the catastrophe that followed, but it mattered. It testified to the indestructibility of the human spirit, even under conditions designed to crush it utterly. The legacy of Ashford Hall is the legacy of the American South, a history of unspeakable acts committed in the service of an economic system and a racial ideology that insisted on the inferiority and inhumanity of black people. It is a history that white Southerners spent generations trying to forget, romanticizing the Old South as a place of grace and gentility, erasing the violence and sexual exploitation that undergirded every aspect of plantation life. But the truth does not disappear simply because it is unspoken. It remains, buried in old letters and deeds, encoded in family trees and genealogies, carried in the bodies and stories of those who survived. These stories matter
because they reveal the true cost of slavery, not just in economic terms or in the gross statistics of suffering, but in the intimate details of individual lives destroyed, families torn apart, souls shattered. They matter because they force us to confront the reality that slavery was not an abstract evil, but a concrete, daily, embodied horror visited upon millions of people over centuries. They matter because the systems of oppression and dehumanization that slavery created did not end with the 13th Amendment. They evolved, adapted, and persisted in new forms: Jim Crow, sharecropping, convict leasing, redlining, mass incarceration, and on and on. The line from Ashford Hall in 1862 to the present day is not a straight one, but it is unbroken. When we tell these stories, we are not engaging in voyeurism or exploitation. We are performing an act of witness and remembrance. We are insisting that the people who suffered and died under slavery were human beings, with names and faces and stories, not abstractions or statistics. We are refusing the comfortable fictions that allow us to look away from the past and its ongoing consequences. We are demanding that we reckon with what was done, who did it, who suffered from it, and who benefited from it. This reckoning is painful, it is uncomfortable, it challenges cherished myths about American history and Southern heritage, but it is necessary. It is the only way forward. The story of Colonel Thaddeus Beaumont Ashford and his wife Eleanor, of Samuel and Moses and Jacob and Isaac and Daniel and Elijah, of Dinah and Hattie and all the others who lived and suffered at Ashford Hall, is a story about power and its corruptions, about desperation and its consequences, about the human capacity for both cruelty and resilience. It is a story that the South tried to forget, but that refuses to be forgotten. It is a story that demands we remember, that we learn, and that we never allow such atrocities to be repeated. If this story has moved you, troubled you, or made you think differently about the legacy of slavery in America, I ask you to share it, to comment with your reflections, and to consider what it means to inherit this history. We are all, in one way or another, living in the shadow of these events. We are all shaped by a past that we did not create, but for which we bear responsibility. The question is not whether we will reckon with this past, but how. Will we do so honestly, courageously, and with a commitment to justice? Or will we continue to turn away, to make excuses, to pretend that history has no bearing on the present? The choice, as it always has been, is ours. These stories, from the shadows of the South, reveal not just the crimes of the past, but the moral clarity we need to build a more just future. The silence that once protected the powerful must give way to truth, however painful, and in that truth, however dark, lies the only path to genuine understanding and reconciliation.